Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, October 14th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very excited to welcome you today for the start of something new and we hope very big, very significant, and we hope meaty as well. This is the launch of our series, A No-Nonsense Guide to 5G. I want to invite you to share this, to like it, to comment, either on the platforms or if you're watching on Broadband Breakfast on Twitter at Broadband Live, so that others can know about this. And pay attention that there will be other events coming forth in future months, one in 2 weeks from now, and then others in November, December, and January. This has been 6 months plus that we at Broadband Breakfast have been doing Broadband Breakfast Live Online. We started focusing on the coronavirus, the issues it was creating. We focused on digital infrastructure, Section 230, champions of broadband, and now we're launching this series. I want to thank Samsung Electronics America for their sponsorship of this series. This would not have been possible without Samsung, and we hope that we will open up a conversation about the real issues. There's certainly been a conversation about hype and claims, and some of them may be real and some of them may be exaggerated. We want to get into that. We want to address exactly what the issues are in 5G from a technology perspective, from a policy, spectrum policy perspective, issues around supply chain and security, and issues of deployment. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up to our 5 guests today. Very grateful for each of you joining us. If you're watching on Broadband Breakfast, you can see bios of each of the 5. So I will just mention the top line, and we're going to go in this order. Blair Levin, the former executive director of the National Broadband Plan. John Godfrey, senior vice president for public policy for Samsung Electronics America. Art King, who is the director of enterprise at Corning Optical Communications. Grant Spellmeyer, vice president of federal affairs and public policy at U.S. Cellular. And Jamie Suskind, vice president of public policy and regulatory affairs at the Consumer Technology Association. So with that, I'm going to turn to each of you for just a few minutes to kind of lay out the landscape that you see without me kind of framing the issues, and then we'll move into that discussion of those topic areas that we just started off with. So I'm going to unmute you, Blair, make you full screen. We love to hear from you on this subject.
Great, Drew. Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be with everybody. Today is certainly good timing given Apple's announcement yesterday, which I think provides an enormous boost to 5G. No one is better than Apple at convincing people that they need to upgrade their devices, their services, etc. Let me just mention 3 things that I think are generally underlooked in the discussion of 5G. Number 1, who will really gain market share as we move to unconnected, untethered devices? Is it really going to be 5G, or will it be next generation Wi-Fi? In other words, are the use cases really more mobile, or are they really more nomadic? Secondly, the political one, there's been a lot of talk about 5G in policy circles, but I think the policy debate in light of COVID is going to change much more dramatically to addressing the digital divide, not just in rural areas, which has been the focus of the FCC, but also in urban areas. It is a different divide, as is primarily about adoption. But as we see more and more essential basic services like education, telehealth, access to job training, etc., become dependent on broadband connectivity, I think the question about the relationship between 5G and that digital divide becomes more important. And then finally, the geopolitical. There has been enormous discussion about the importance of America winning in 5G. I once asked at a public forum, Ajit Pai, what was the metric for international leadership? And he answered that it was kind of like the justice's famous statement about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. With respect to Chairman Pai, that is a horrible answer. We ought to have an understanding of what really are the metrics for international 5G leadership. Is it really about networks? Is it really about applications? Is it about jobs? These are difficult questions, but I think that is one that we have to have a much more serious discussion about in this country, because I certainly agree with those who say that leadership in the general ecosystem is important to future economic leadership. Back to you, Drew.
Thank you, Blair. I might mention that this is my second webcast of today. At 7 o'clock, I was on a Broadband World Forum in the UK. Well, quote, in the UK. It's virtual, like everything today. And it was a discussion called F5G, as in fiber 5G. So you see, 5G's gotten so prominent that people are now naming fiber standards after the wireless 5G. So the worlds are very different. This was a UK, European, Asian market, and the US voice doesn't seem to be as present there. So with that kind of hopefully not too sour note, let's hear from John. Tell us a little bit about some of the optimism that you feel for 5G, the 5G future that you at Samsung have been talking up quite a bit.
Sure, Drew. Thank you. And thank you to all my fellow panelists and to you for tuning in. Samsung is really excited to be sponsoring this series of no-nonsense 5G with Drew, whom I've known for many years. Really glad to be working with you again, Drew. Blair, I do have to respond to something you said. Obviously, I'm sure people won't be surprised. We're really happy at Samsung to see the 5G consumer space taking off with that announcement this week. Samsung, though, has had 5G in our phones for more than a year and a half. We have a huge lineup of 5G phones at affordable price points, from the top of the line down to the much more affordable phones, really democratizing 5G for the consumer. So we are very excited about 5G. We're also a supplier of 5G network equipment to operators all over the world. I think 5G is worth the hype, and the reason is, kind of the flippant answer is 5G really is a whole nother G, and they don't give out a G very often. About once every 10 years, there's a generational shift in the technology for mobile wireless networks, and it's a significant leap forward in capabilities in the platform. I'll tell you one thing 5G is not, and you just alluded to it, Drew. It's not or it shouldn't be, a marketing term that people start throwing around all over the place. My neighbor was telling me how he's putting 5G wireless into his home. He's not. He just got a 5 gigahertz router. 5 gigahertz is nothing to do with 5G. 5G is a set of technologies that are managed by and usually by a commercial operator, but it could be a private 5G network in an enterprise setting. And it adds speed, low latency, and massive device connectivity. And with that platform, my answer, to your question, Blair, about what is the metric for a country's competitiveness in 5G is going to be the applications and services that appear on top of that new platform. Just like when 4G came along 10 years ago, people did not know what it was going to be used for. I remember skepticism about whether people really needed to download their email faster. We didn't know about ride sharing. We didn't know about video chatting and video streaming. All kinds of new applications, social media, which is ubiquitous throughout your day now, new applications, and huge amounts of economic value that were created on top of that platform. And because the United States deployed the 4G platform first in the world broadly, a lot of that innovation happened in the United States. Today, 5G is much more broadly deployed in China and some other places than in the U.S. But we're working fast in the U.S. to deploy that platform so that innovation on top of 5G can happen in America, where we want it to.
That is so important to highlight the importance of apps. Like you've said, John, I think it's great to frame the way 4G took off because of apps like ride sharing, like Facebook, like Netflix. We need to be thinking about, well, what are those apps, right? Because you can't just have better broadband. You need to have the apps to translate that to better lives. I'm kind of alluding to our motto here, but I appreciate that landscape for us, John. I'm going to turn now to Art King, and very, very grateful for your joining us here on this program. Art, tell us a little bit about your role at Corning and why a traditionally, like that's what I think, a fiber company, glass manufacturer. Corning's obviously very established in the fiber marketplace. What's your take and approach on the 5G, and you personally as well, from Spider, the company that brought you to Corning? So I'm going to unmute you and highlight you, Art.
Okay, so it's been a interesting journey. You know, our organization has a extremely large and healthy RF business, selling RAN equipment, radio access network equipment, to carriers, and we're in the situation now where optical fibers have finally become very relevant and necessary to carry everything, because the copper networks are being overwhelmed by just the sheer speed that devices can attain now. So, you know, Corning is in this business both on the radio side and also the transport side, and it's you know, we focus on a niche of indoors, but you know, it's a very good business. This is 5G has been fantastically marketed, you know, actually way ahead of the tech. But when you see that, you know, the Deloitte surveyed 415 network managers about a month ago, and they came out of it with conclusions of 93% of enterprise, you know, executives feel that they will have Wi-Fi 6 and 5G co-adopted within the next 3 years. And it's just stunning to see that, because mobility has just penetrated our consciousness like at the consumer level like never before. You know, LTE didn't have this kind of push and by the industry and into the market compared to, you know, what we're seeing today. You know, the other thing that happened is COVID pulled us into the future in the enterprise space. And I'm saying that because of business continuity. Many people who were wired, had a desk phone, had a desktop computer, have become wireless, and they won't be going back. You know, in many enterprises, we're eventually going to unwire because of just the cost of operations of having wires connected to, you know, devices, but for people. And because COVID pulled us into this future, you know, the new baseline for wireless is going to be far higher than, you know, what we experienced, say, as early as last March. So, you know, the 5G is going to have a place in just, you know, humble mobile broadband, with the need for just the raw bandwidth to support this new baseline of usage, and the fact that people have gone, you know, unwired. And the other thing that we're optimistic about and interested in is the whole public safety dimension. There's a lot of gaps in LTE that the standards are looking to remediate. So public safety, such as E911 location, and, you know, many things around that are actually built into the standards. So, you know, we think public safety is going to see a great revolution happening, where the E911 is going to be solved for inside in a much more effective way in the infrastructure compared to where we're at today. So I'll hand it back to you.
Just speak for another moment or two, Art, if you would, about the role of indoor deployments versus kind of more broad deployments. What special issues are associated with those environments and settings that will be germane to our discussion today and in the future?
Sure. So two things. Indoor deployments have usually trailed the outdoor network deployments by a couple of years. That's changed. We're seeing demand now for 5G for indoors as fast as it's going to be available for outdoors. So we're paralleling the deployment of the macro outdoor network and indoor networks at the same time. So that's been a real revolution there.
Great, great. Well, again, we're gonna talk about all these topics. I just wanted to get a couple words out first. So let's turn to you now, Grant Spellmeyer. Thank you for being on and giving the carrier's perspective, the provider's perspective. I went to your site and looked at where you have 5G available, and it looks like it's a couple pockets of Illinois and Iowa. Familiar with Illinois and also Iowa. I lived in both states. To talk about that, talk about elsewhere. How does U.S. Cellular look at 5G kind of in compared to the national behemoths and their role in this marketplace?
Thank you, Drew, and good afternoon. Glad to be here. I'm not used to being the sole carrier representative on a panel. Kind of excited to get that opportunity to do that today. So just a little bit of background. U.S. Cellular
we asked others, Grant. So thank you for stepping up to the plate.
They're scared to debate me. We're now the fourth largest carrier in the country with the disappearance of T-Mobile. We serve 21 states. As you said, we've got a 5G deployment underway in northern Illinois and Wisconsin and Iowa and a little bit of Maine. That's going to continue to expand out rather quickly as we work with our various network partners, including Samsung. I've got my new top-of-the-line Samsung 5G phone here with me, and we're working with Samsung on various network-related things as well. It's an exciting time. Yesterday was a big day, not only because of Apple joining Samsung, but also, if you saw it, it didn't get a lot of coverage, but Addis announced the creation of a group to work on 6G. So hold on to your hats. We're gonna be moving forward quickly on that. U.S. Cellular's deployment is in some ways similar to what's going on at T-Mobile. We're standing up our 5G initial deployment over 600 megahertz in our footprint. I would also note that we were the second largest bidder in the 28 gigahertz auction. So we've got a substantial holding there, and I think that'll play a role as we move forward. The other thing I would note is that we are in an anti-collusion period for the C-band auction. So you're going to see me be a little bit more circumspect on what I might say on certain items related to spectrum. Apologize for having to do that, but that's the state of affairs right now, and I don't want to get in trouble at the FCC. To date, I don't think we've seen the killer use case arrive for 5G. As Blair indicated, there's a lot of focus coming out of COVID and of course pre-COVID on the digital divide. That's not only rural versus urban, but it is an affordability question. We have a new CEO at U.S. Cellular. He has charged me in Washington with working on both the coverage problem in rural America as well as the affordability problem. 5G is going to play a role in that, but more fundamentally, we see there's a lot of stuff that can be done on advanced LTE deployments that will do a great deal to close the short-term digital divide. You just really need a decent connection in order to do what we're doing here today. So we're focused on putting 5G out as fast as we can to as many places as we can affordably. There's going to be a role for government to continue to foster some of that in the remote areas and to address the affordability issues. I'm certain that no matter who wins the elections in Washington in a few weeks, we will see that issue come back to the forefront next year. So I'll close there for now.
Quick question, Grant. What is the biggest inhibitor of expanding your 5G deployment beyond the current footprint you're offering?
Well, I think I would answer that to be affordability. It's costly to deploy network in rural America, both because you've got more geography to cover and you've got fewer subscribers per square mile to divide that cost over. It gets worse the farther out you get. So, you'll see it come to our more urban markets first and then continue to push out from there as technological advances from Samsung and Corning and others come along. But that's the biggest point, and it remains the biggest point.
Okay, great. Let's turn to Jamie Suskind of the Consumer Technology Association. From your perspective, Jamie, what are the biggest policy issues raised by 5G momentum, and where does, on a scale of bullish to bearish, where does CTA stand on the technology?
Oh, great. Thanks so much for having me join you this afternoon. So for folks who don't know CTA, our members, of which there are about 2,000, are the world's leading innovators, including startups to global brands, and they help support more than 18 million American jobs. Our membership includes both Samsung and Apple, since we're talking about both of their excellent phone products today. And CTA also owns and produces CES, which is the most influential tech event on the planet. So at CTA, we're really excited about 5G and the possibilities it presents for tech innovations. And as the US is embarking on the transition to 5G, consumer demand for connected devices of all kinds, higher speed applications, and more data intensive services will only continue to grow. Obviously, analyst reports can differ. One report we've cited in the past, though, said that the number of connected IoT devices is projected to reach over 75 billion worldwide by 2025, which is a 5-fold increase over a 10-year period. So what does that mean in practical terms? At CTA, our president and CEO, Gary Shapiro, likes to say that every company is a tech company. So that means that all of the new tech innovations that we're hearing about every day, like AI, augmented and virtual reality, robotics, blockchain, and edge computing, will either rely on or be enhanced by 5G connectivity. So they will all stand to benefit from 5G deployment and the steps that policymakers take to further expedite 5G deployment in the US. So as others have said, COVID has only highlighted the importance of these conversations about deployment, spectrum, security, other key policy areas that we're all focusing on when we think about 5G. And I think the good news is that we're seeing the tech industry, carriers, and other infrastructure companies stepping up to the challenge, particularly in light of COVID and all the issues surrounding what's going on now. But I definitely look forward to talking more about all of the policies that CTA is advocating for to help speed the transition to 5G in the US.
Well, wonderful. With that, let's open it up. Again, I'd like us to kind of cover these questions, perhaps generally speaking, in order, although if you've got something very relevant, jump in. Where does the technology stand now? Obviously, John, you've been offering 5G devices for a year and a half here, but are the networks caught up, right? I mean, that's sort of something that we're probing. Maybe I'd love your perspective first, John, on where is the U.S. on 5G versus the rest of the world and other countries and their deployments of 5G. Oh, sorry. Let me unmute you. I apologize. There we go.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I could unmute myself or not, but thank you for doing that. The U.S. is doing pretty well. The U.S. had the world's first 5G commercial network launch and the world's first network equipment for 5G, which was Samsung's equipment anywhere in the world. But there are definitely a lot more 5G base stations in China today than there are in the US. There's more subscribers there, more subscribers in Korea than in the US at this point. But I would say the US did a great job of allocating the very high frequency bands, the millimeter wave bands for 5G, and has done a great job on the low bands. Part of that is still the dividend from the transition to digital television.
Yeah,
it's the mid band where we're lacking, and the U.S. is well behind, and the rest of the world has been focusing on the mid band. And you may have heard people say this before, but the mid band is kind of the sweet spot. The channels are big enough that you can get some very significant data rates. The channels are typically wider than at the low band. They're not nearly as wide as up in the high bands, up in the millimeter wave band. And the channel size is the main thing that determines the speed. So The midband also propagates farther than the high bands, not as far as the low bands. So it's right in the middle. Good compromise between throughput and coverage. And so a lot of the rest of the world has deployed in that 3 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz range, and there's a lot of equipment for that. But the US has just completed the CBRS PAL auction. There's going to be a C-band auction in December that Grant can't comment on, but I can. And it's going to be very important for that auction to happen on time, for the US carriers to begin deploying, because that's going to be a real sweet spot. And then the FCC just recently took steps towards setting rules for the band right below CBRS, 3450 to 3550, which would look like it would be shared with defense users. And so all of that will help the US catch up in that important midband.
So that's a really important thing to highlight, the way 5G appears to enable weaving together the low, mid, and high bands with different capabilities. Obviously, low band 600 megahertz can penetrate walls and foliage much easier than high and even mid bands, but more capacity can go through those millimeter wave bands. So how much of the problem, if I put it this way, problem or the lagginess of the US deployment adoption of 5G is attributable to spectrum issues or other issues? And let's open this up to whoever would like to comment. Feel free to raise your hand or just jump in or use the chat window, and I'll recognize you and we can go forward. But John, do you want to kind of tackle that one first?
Well, I think part of it is also killer applications for 5G, because carriers have to return, they have to earn a return on their investment, and it's expensive to deploy. But I do want to highlight that although, speed is just one of the advantages that 5G brings, and the high data rates that you get in the higher bands are important for applications that require a high data rate, video intensive, telepresence, machine vision, those kinds of applications. But the other two really big big advantages of 5G are low latency and massive device connectivity, and those apply in any spectrum. So the low spectrum, the 600 megahertz, even if the data rates are not a whole lot faster than 4G, you're going to have the potential for massive device connectivity. So lots and lots of sensors in a factory or in along a roadway, and the potential for low latency for a more natural real-time kind of a telepresence experience, or for signaling between a roadway and a car. So I think the key for deployment in the US is going to be finding those earlier use cases that can take advantage of the platform. And I'll let others comment. But I think one of the, spoiler alert, I think one of the answers is going to be enterprise 5G applications.
Well, absolutely. And that's one of our upcoming events on November 18th is the enterprise case study. But Art, let's get to your take. Is it the lack of applications and use cases, or is it the core networks, voice support? To talk through some of these technology questions, Art.
Yeah, so the core networks, essentially 5G right now is rolling out the radio access network layer, while the core networks are remaining LTE. And it's a compatibility issue to make sure that the most people can be connected and in the best service possible, because the country's so vast. Voice support it needs to be standardized and deployed onto new radio, so that we can eventually get to the what's called the standalone core, where LTE won't be involved, and things like the ultra reliable low latency communication that John was alluding to, and network slicing, where you can have different priorities and different slices of the infrastructure available for innovation. There's the concept of network slices and being able to build those on demand across the network for corporate customers or apps that need something special from the infrastructure just seems like such a fertile ground for the future.
Yeah, we're not afraid to ask the dumb questions, Art, and so I'm going to ask you the dumb question, which is, tell us what a core network is and a RAN or radio network is, and why that's important. Because we're hearing lots of talk about RAN and Open RAN and other RANs.
Right.
But distinguish for us, is the core network that's also for other forms, non-wireless, non-5G form of infrastructure?
Marginally, but in general, the cellular core networks have all the switching and controls for mobility and services and connected to the internet and that type of thing. And the radio access network is essentially everything that you put out on the towers and inside enterprise buildings to provide service and coverage inside them. So there's just a large conglomeration of equipment and services that live in telco data centers, and even emerging in different commercial cloud providers like Microsoft and Google.
Jamie, would you care to address some of the issues of infrastructure as you see it, and what we need infrastructure-wise to get to greater 5G deployment?
Sure, thanks. So at CTA, we have been advocates of the FCC's work to reform the infrastructure rules, both at the federal level and then where it pertains to state and local siting regulations. And I think Blair will probably want to jump in after I've talked on this point, because I know this is a big work on. So look, right, and I mean, no offense to Grant or anything here, but like USF can't do it forever. USF clearly has not been enough to close the digital divide. I think we need to be thinking holistically, right? We need to be thinking about further ways to streamline our infrastructure rules to make sure that it's affordable for carriers to put in the networks and make those networks sustainable, right? I mean, it is not sustainable to have a USF contribution factor of 25%. That's just not doable, particularly when it's not fully working. And I should say CTA doesn't engage in USF. This is just me channeling my former life as a wireline advisor at the FCC. I think we do think that the FCC is going down the right path. I think that, Gary, as I said, our CEO, has talked about delays, particularly on the parts of states and localities and siting infrastructure. And, I think reasonable minds can differ over sort of what that means for actual deployment. But, I think the FCC has been right in focusing on expediting getting the infrastructure into the ground and making it, a viable investment for those carriers to be doing it all over the country, not just in, New York City or San Jose or Miami or the places that are, affordable, where there's lots of people who can pay for the service.
Blair, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, if I could give a couple of contrarian points just for the sake of, making it a little more interesting. Number one, I think the most important question is what really drives leadership. And there was a view that it's application and services. That might be true, but I would argue that the reason we won in 4G was not because we deployed first, we didn't, not because we deployed the most, we didn't. It really was two things. Number one, we had the intellectual property of the chips, Qualcomm, and we had the operating systems, Apple and Android. And I think that then drives a lot in terms of the applications and the services. Though I was delighted by John's answer on Samsung. Samsung has been a leader in 5G, and I was talking about Apple's marketing prowess, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But it was it's going to be a lot of fun both to watch the battle between Apple and Samsung, which I think is a wonderful thing, a wonderful kind of competition. But I don't think it's just about the applications and services. And I would also note that if it is about the applications, we now have another element with this antitrust law. And if you look at the House report of a couple of weeks ago, going after the applications that are actually the most used, it raises some interesting questions about international leadership. I'm not advocating for or after. In terms of infrastructure, look, I'm been pretty public. I think the FCC went exactly the wrong way, because whereas I agree that it was important to drive speed of deployment, by making the cities the enemies, I think they actually slowed it down. I think there were a lot of ways that the BDAC in which they...
And just tell us what the BDAC is, Blair.
Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, which was entirely of industry. It included very few cities. Nick Pagani, the aide to Pi, said, why should we care what cities think? They're not deploying anything. And frankly, I think cities actually look at it quite differently. I think you really slowed things down by doing that. And I would just make a couple of other quick points. Number one, there was simply a transfer of wealth, right? There was a couple $1 billion you transfer from cities, which is to say firemen, police, teachers, to the private sector companies who have no obligation to deploy anywhere. And so what you see, and this goes to the digital divide question, and it's hard. I'm not saying enterprises should be forced to build out anywhere, but what you see is building out in wealthy communities, and you don't see it being built out anywhere, everywhere. The economic theory that was articulated by people like Commissioner Carr was, if you drive down the price of deployment in San Jose, you'll get deployment in Montana. Look, I work on Wall Street. That's where I've worked most of the last 20 years. No one on Wall Street believes that. No one believes that. It's done on a local basis. And this has been said by several others, where there's going to be a return. There were a lot of things that could have been done. And I worked on this 10 years ago when we were doing Gig.U and Google Fiber and working with local governments to solve those fiber deployment problems. And over a couple year period, we came up with a lot of voluntary ways of really standardizing the process, et cetera. Could have been done here, but instead it was really done with kind of a political agenda rather than what I would think of as a more practical agenda. But having said that, I mean, this is now in a lot of ways water under the dam. And so I don't really see, I see lots of ways that you can accelerate it. But the biggest thing that is impeding deployment is really Wall Street, because Wall Street wants to have greater clarity about what the return is going to be. And I would just note Verizon recently said that they're going to drop the $10 extra that they were charging for 5G. And I assume it's because people weren't willing to pay it. But when you have new CapEx, but you don't have new revenue, that's a problem for Wall Street.
Blair, you can just solve it through your newsletter. Just explain it to them.
Well, if you want, send me some copy. I'll just put it right in, John.
Blair, it's not water under the bridge to the extent that there's been an expectation built that, in fact, and maybe this is the most cynical argument, that 5G has been used politically by certain industry players to advance the expedited siting. And the argument has been, well, rural 5G is going to come along here. Now, when I talk to people, most people are not expecting 5G of the sort we're talking about to come to rural areas anytime soon. I'd love to hear a different point of view from Grant or from
I just say very, very quickly, Drew. Of course it is, but we should not get upset with companies for using popular arguments. And I would just note that Cable the other day came out with a 10G argument that said, if we move to 10G, we'll have a $330 billion addition to the American economy. Well, look, I mean, this is what companies are supposed to do, but you're supposed to have regulators who are sophisticated enough to understand what's really going on. And in this case, I don't think the FCC did.
Grant, John, what's your reaction to this point Blair has made? And I've egged him on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a lot to respond to there, an awful lot. First of all, back up to Jamie. I think Jamie's right. USF is not enough to get this done. It hasn't gotten it done. There are challenges with the contribution factor, and I hope we can work on those things. I think it's going to take a broader congressional broadband initiative to deal with the digital divide. Jamie's right that we've made a lot of progress through citing initiatives that the FCC's done. I also think Blair's right that, we're certainly making municipalities the enemy is a tactic that may or may not be fruitful in the long run. US Cellular doesn't experience a whole lot of siting challenges in rural America. They come along every once in a while in a particular municipality, but to us, it is more about economics. Earlier in the discussion, John touched on mid-band spectrum. There is a vital importance of getting additional mid-band out to deal with the rural problem. It's one of the reasons South Korea is ahead is that they've got much higher population density than we do in rural America. And then to kind of come back around to Blair, who, by the way, does have the best newsletter in the industry, and if you don't read it, you should. It's my first read when it comes out. He's right about the Wall Street and the economics. This is about return on capital for anybody who's needs to rely on Wall Street for financing. And this is an incredibly expensive, capital-intensive project layered on an already generally over-leveraged industry. And there's no new, the new services have not materialized yet to allow the carriers to monetize any of it. There's no new revenue coming in, and it's creating a real crunch. And that crunch gets more difficult in rural America. So
what is
debate.
the ultimate revenue case, Grant, for 5G from a carrier's perspective?
No, I'm pausing because I don't spend a ton of time with my bright finance minds on the revenue side of things. You're going to have to pay for tremendous amounts of capital investment over time in an industry that's already fiercely competitive. Prices, if you look at ARPU over the last decade, it's come down dramatically across the industry. And, we believe that we have a sustainable, profitable model, but it is why, as I answered earlier, economics is the biggest problem in rural America and why you won't see it in rural Montana anytime soon.
If I could just cautiously venture into the financial territory, in South Korea, just the early data coming in is the average revenue per user, the ARPU, for the 5G subscribers is higher than for the 4G subscribers. They've priced 5G aggressively there, but they are still getting people to adopt unlimited plans and spend more. Is it enough more to pay for the infrastructure investment quickly? That I don't know the answer to. I think 5G is going to have to open up some completely new revenue opportunities for carriers. It can't just be people with cell phone subscriptions. It's also got to be machines that are connecting to the network, enterprises that are paying for a managed network service. Those kinds of new opportunities and new applications, I think, will have to drive it.
What are some of your thoughts about those new apps, and as well as the kind of indoor marketplace we talked a little bit about?
John is spot on talking about managed services. The manifestation of the capital crunch that we see is the hurdle on the business case for an operator to invest in putting in infrastructure inside an enterprise building is markedly higher. So we're really seeing the enterprises having to step in and take financial responsibility for delivering service inside the building. The problem created by a LEED building where you save on electricity, but you wiped out cellular service is really being recognized as a self-imposed issue, and the costs are being transferred back to the enterprise. And that's a good thing because the uses of potentially private 5G and some sort of integration with the public operators has a lot of promise to drive innovation both on manufacturing lines and potentially on the corporate carpeted floors.
I want to come back as well to this whole issue of how 5G fits into the broader broadband ecosystem. And Blair, I think one of the great things about the National Broadband Plan is it prompted a lot of strategic thinking, if you will, for the nation, right? And what kinds of speeds and capabilities and service qualities do we want in the future? And I am heartened that we don't see necessarily the same wireless versus wired debates we've sometimes had. I mean, everyone who's deploying 5G also talks in the same breath about the fiber. I'd love, Blair, for you to talk a little more about this too, as well as Art and Grant and others who have thoughts on how, as a nation, progress in 5G it also depends upon progress on fiber deployment.
Well, I kind of just want to repeat your last sentence. progress in 5G depends upon fiber deployment. So, and it depends. I mean, John earlier gave a description of the difference between low band, mid band, and high band. And that's exactly right. In high band, you need a lot more fiber. You need the radios are following a smaller area. Low band, you need less fiber in a way because you got better coverage, but you don't have capacity. And so mid band's the sweet spot. And I do think it's worth noting that I think it was unfortunate that we spent 2 years arguing about the simplest issue at the FCC, whether the C-band auction should be an FCC auction or a private auction. When that was finally resolved, we could just move forward, but we could have auctioned that spectrum a long time ago, and that would have been a good thing. But yeah, I mean, it's everything now is really a network of networks, and so we're absolutely we need ways of deploying those radios faster, but we also need ways of deploying the fiber faster. I suspect Jamie and pretty much every other panelist knows more than me about the practicalities of that.
Well, Jamie, let's hear from you on some of these issues, okay?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think even beyond just fiber and wireless, right? At CTA, we've been pretty bullish about even different sorts of solutions for closing the digital divide. So we have been supportive of Amazon's Project Kuiper, the low Earth orbit satellite solution. I think that's interesting and has the potential to bring broadband to places where, you might not be hearing other folks talk about that at this point. And obviously, yeah, I mean, you do need a network of networks. You can't have a satellite operate all by itself and then expect it to get to people's houses. But we think that is an interesting model. We're happy to see that Chairman Pai is moving forward with a white spaces order. Microsoft's a member. We've been pretty bullish on that as a solution. So yeah, I think we need to be talking about this more holistically, right? I mean, and I've even had to catch myself, I think, in, writing things to the FCC where it's not even just like 5G, right? Because there are lots of next generation technologies that are not just a licensed wireless solution. So we definitely need to be thinking about
what's the FCC not doing right, Jamie? What should the next administration do differently to help advance 5G or broadband in general?
No, the thing we've yelled at them the most on lately has nothing to do with this. I've been in the 230 weeds, so you don't want to hear about that. That's where we've been yelling at them lately. To advance broadband in general. Yeah, I mean, I think I've already said that I think less focus on USF, and this is me coming as me, I think actually would be helpful and more conversation about not just how to reform those programs, but maybe on a way to actually one day maybe wean off of those programs, I think would be useful. I think we, going forward, have some concerns about the FCC trying to exert jurisdiction in the network security space, which I know John will, I think, agree with me on. That is not a thing that we would feel comfortable with them doing, no matter who runs the administration going forward. I think that's a caution we would give them, and we don't want to see that. I think there's a role for the FCC to be coordinating with other agencies and ensuring that networks are secure, particularly since 5G security is such a big deal these days. But I would caution them against trying to take a lead role or sort of be the primary one at the table there.
So as a reminder, we're trying to set the table for all of the issues that we'll be talking about in other segments of this series, this No Nonsense Guide to 5G, including the supply chain we'll talk about in 2 weeks, issues of enterprise technology, deployment and rights away, which we chatted about, and spectrum too. And John, I know you've got some thoughts on some of the issues in licensed versus unlicensed, and maybe across the different bands that you talked about earlier, low, mid, and high.
Sure. A moment ago we were talking about that the answer to the question is, do we need wireline or wireless? And the answer is both. I think a question that is getting discussed a lot is, do we need unlicensed, licensed? And the answer to that one is also both. But I do want to clear away a little bit of the nonsense. 5G is not Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is not 5G. And so you could deploy 5G in unlicensed spectrum. That can be done. One of the challenges of doing that is the economics of making an investment of deploying infrastructure and managing that infrastructure in spectrum that you don't have access to is a little bit harder investment case to make, but not impossible. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in some of the spectrum bands where people are adopting a somewhat unlicensed model like CBRS, and we'll see how that works. Wi-Fi, when people say Wi-Fi, what they're really talking about is the IEEE standards for a short-range local area networking type of a technology that is not a centrally managed service quality guaranteed network. And the technology's evolved a lot over the years. The performance is good, but it is not a managed network. So it is not going to deliver exactly the same performance as 5G does. So some of the applications that people talk about for 5G could be done on Wi-Fi also, and some of them couldn't. And so kind of a hype busting test that I like to apply when people are talking about 5G and all the beautiful new applications that are coming are the things they are describing things you could just do today with Wi-Fi, or are they things that take advantage of the unique capabilities of 5G? And you can pop a lot of bubbles that way. I think there will be applications that ride over both, but things that need really guaranteed service quality, that need maybe a secure end-to-end network slice with low latency, things that are determining whether your car crashes or not, for example, or whether I don't think there's going to be robotic surgery where a robot does surgery on you, but there might be a surgeon looking over the shoulder of an emergency medical technician at a car crash scene, coaching them through a procedure. You better have good service quality and low latency for that. I think you need to test whether when people are talking about 5G versus Wi-Fi, whether they understand the differences between them.
Yeah, thanks. Important because Wi-Fi, of course, is primarily unlicensed, and I think what you're saying is 5G is primarily licensed, but there's certainly
we'll see. I mean,
Yeah.
there may be some deployments of 5G technology into unlicensed spectrum, just as there was a little bit of unlicensed LTE that never really took off for the reason I mentioned. It's a harder investment case to make, but people may try again with 5G.
I want Art and Grant to react to this question. Art, you first.
Repeat the question, please.
Licensed versus unlicensed. Do you see kind of the more action taking place in the licensed? Is it important to make sure FCC's pushing forth on licensed auctions, or are you more excited about spectrum sharing opportunities and unlicensed band?
Operators are allergic to unlicensed spectrum in general. We've got a huge installed base of the LTE LAA radios, which use Wi-Fi as boost spectrum for downlink towards the mobiles. But in general, we see CBRS even being coupled with a licensed channel in order to have the control. And you see the PAL auction, where finally with the CBRS PALs, we might have a lot more usage of CBRS by the operators, because it will be part of their strategy. And to a point earlier made, it will be a guaranteed bandwidth as far as the spectrum being available to them for usage. Yeah.
Grant, any quick reacts on that?
Well, I certainly think licensed is going to be more important than unlicensed, and should be the primary focus of the FCC. We strongly objected, and as did a number of other wireless carriers, to the decision in the 6 gigahertz proceeding at the start of the year, where they gave away 1,200 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to unlicensed, and have now turned around and are searching for a way to find 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to auction in 2021. But that's water over the dam. It's done, I guess, subject to a couple of petitions for recon. But there have been additional paths to more mid-band spectrum that were overlooked.
Let's hear from Blair on what the FCC should be doing differently, and let's turn then to our last topic of security and what the U.S. needs to do in this regard. So Blair, go ahead.
I'll just make a quick observation that the biggest upside for industry and the economy is to get the approximately 30% of Americans who are not online today online. Now, some of that has to do with getting networks out. That's approximately 25% of the problem. 75% of the problem are people who haven't adopted. There's only one FCC program, only one federal government program designed to do that. That's the Lifeline program. It's highly inadequate for the challenge that it has. But in the most extraordinary and I don't think many people notice this, what the FCC is going to adopt in a few days is an item that basically says, the DC Circuit basically said that if we adopt Title I, we can't really fund any broadband through Lifeline. We think that, we think our analysis is that we can, but hey, if we can't support broadband with Lifeline, it's still worth the cost because Title I is so important, has done such great things for America. Putting aside their logic, what they're basically saying is, we're willing to sacrifice all federal government support to get low-income people on broadband. And so that's, I think, the single biggest challenge that we as a country face. That's the single biggest upside. And I will just say, as we actually said 10 years ago, the cost of the digital divide is large and growing. It is so much larger now, and it's growing so much more in a kind of COVID, post-COVID, remote everything economy and society. And the FCC is basically saying, not our problem.
Yeah. So one of the issues that just keeps coming up in some ways in the popular mind, 5G is proxy for, is perhaps new Cold War is a little too strong, but some others have used it between the United States and China. And we've heard about how U.S. may not be as advanced in its deployment. And Blair has raised another point earlier in this discussion about, well, wait a second, if we're going to drive this through apps and all the apps that our people are going to use, like Facebook and Google and things like that, and if they're now kind of being pressured from other aspects in the government, what is going to drive 5G in America? Is it going to be the infrastructure? Is it going to be the apps? And we get to this very concerning for many people point about the largest telecommunications equipment manufacturer in the world is a Chinese company, Huawei, right? I mean, there's also, of course, Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung that are participants, but we're kind of facing this odd situation where the elephant in the room is a very large and growing company, and the U.S. has raised many concerns about that recently. So let's kind of get everyone's reaction to this quickly. This, of course, again, is just the kickoff of our 5-part series together in partnership with Samsung Electronics America. What are your thoughts on the national security issues associated with 5G? And let's just go around from John to Art and Blair.
Sure. Well, Samsung is happy that generally when people talk about the trusted infrastructure providers, they include us. We feel like we're trustworthy. We're glad to be in that conversation. And of course, South Korea, where Samsung's headquarters is a very long-term close defense ally of the United States. And we have deep ties in the United States as a company with lots of investment here. But as you know, the U.S. government's been going around the world raising awareness of the national security importance of network infrastructure. Hopefully, there can be more worldwide collaboration and cooperation. There was an interesting conference in Prague a year ago on 5G security that came up with a set of recommendations that governments would try to follow. They recently met again virtually, so that conversation is continuing, and I think that's productive. One other thing I would mention is Samsung is one of the founders of the Open RAN Policy Coalition, which has made a splash in Washington this year. Open RAN is about open standards in the radio access network. It's not really about security, but the connection to security is that if it's able to, if open standards are able to allow a more competitive ecosystem with more new entrants, then it gives everyone a little more confidence that things are going to continue to be sustainable, that there will be a dynamic enough market that you can trust the market to deliver secure solutions. And we do think that's the case.
Thanks for raising the Open RAN issue. I'm sure we're going to discuss that quite a bit at our next session on October 28th. Art, and then we'll just go around the squares here.
Okay. Our supply chain resides in TAA countries, so we don't manufacture in any country that's not designated by the U.S. as acceptable. So the Trade Agreements Act is just something that we've followed since the beginning on the manufacturing side. Our hardware has a huge amount of security hooks built into it, and every software release that we do, it's attacked by white hats, and then it's run through the regression testing and attacks in the service provider labs. So it's we do a lot with the operator partners to ensure that we're releasing a solution that meets the regulatory needs for privacy and security.
Thanks, Grant. How do you view this as a provider?
Well, so a decade ago, we faced the opportunity to deploy Chinese equipment in our LTE network, and we passed on it then at a substantial additional cost to ourselves. We're certainly very happy we did that with where that situation has played out. It's a real threat. It needs to be fixed. Finding strong alternative vendors is very important, and people are focused on it. That's all I'll say.
Great. Jamie, what are your reactions?
Yeah, these are really important issues, and in my time at CTA, I focused on it a lot. It's a pretty big part of my portfolio. I would say, we appreciate that the administration is focusing on ensuring our networks are secure, but we have a lot of concerns with some of the steps that are being taken to clamp down on some global supply chain activities, for the reason that supply chains for many of our members are global. And I think we are concerned that some of these things are too blunt, some of the rulemakings that are going on, and we've commented a lot. And, I wouldn't want to see us cutting off our nose to spite our face. We participate in a lot of standards bodies, industry-led voluntary standards bodies, and different multi-stakeholder fora, where private sector and public sector and international representatives have the chance to collaborate. And I think we see that as probably the best opportunity for continuing to identify and fix security risks. I think the Open RAN coalition that John mentioned is good. We've not taken a public position on the technology, but I think that's a successful example of folks talking through these issues in the way that it should be happening. So I think, we would probably just urge some caution here, because things are not maybe on the face of them as simple as just, don't use this vendor, right? I won't defend Huawei, but it might not be as simple as just like, don't use this vendor, things will be fine.
Okay, Blair, final words for us.
Well, while I agree that China actually is a threat, what I would say is the single most important criteria for leadership is to have people who follow you. And the single worst way to get people to follow you is to start the discussion by saying, I'm totally in this for myself. I don't give a shit about you. And unfortunately, what the United States has done, and you see this in the fullness of time, we're going to recognize that blowing up the TPP was one of the stupidest things we could have ever done. We don't have the international support. Back in '97, when we were negotiating the World Trade Organization telecom agreement, we had a huge amount of moral and political capital in the rest of the countries of the world, or most of the countries of the world. We don't have that anymore, and we're blowing it. So whatever we think tactically, and there are a lot of things that have been said that I totally agree with, our ability to get others to make sure that we have the market that we want internationally is being compromised by the fact that the rest of the world no longer trusts our leadership.
Well, great closing words, Blair. Very appropriate for our election season that is coming up quite soon. We are very grateful again for each of you, Blair, Art, Grant, Jamie, and John. Thank you to Samsung Electronics America for sponsoring this 5-part series on a no-nonsense guide to 5G. We'll be back next week at Broadband Breakfast Live Online for another event. But the next one in this series will be on October 28th, 2 weeks from now. We're going to discuss trusted partners and national security. I'm Drew Clark for Broadband Breakfast. Thanks for being with us today. See you next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern.